Okay, this week for podcast number 50, I wanted to get a special guest, and I was able to wrangle him into it. Luckily, I'm getting him in between some crazy release stuff and a trip to Berlin and all that stuff, and so I'm feeling pretty lucky that we have the opportunity to talk to Joshua Kit Clayton. Joshua works with me at Cycling 74. He's the Chief Technology Officer, Director of Engineering, and probably one of the smartest people I've ever met, and one of the people who's most savvy about code. So it's really great to get a chance to work with him, and it's also a great chance to talk to him today. Hey, Joshua, how are you doing?
Good. Too kind. Thanks for having me. And hello, all you podcast listeners.
Yeah, thanks. We actually we've developed a really nice audience. I'm pretty pleased, and it seems like people are going kind of out of their way to introduce one another to it. So it's been a really neat organic growth to the podcast. I'm pretty excited about that.
Cool.
The way that I tend to do this podcast is I tend to start it off by asking people to tell me a little bit about their background. And that normally generates like the next 10 questions. But so let's start you off with that. Can you tell me a little bit about your background, and particularly what in your background has developed or existed to make you the person that you are now artistically?
Oh my Lord, there's how far back do we want to go? So anyway, been making music for a long time. I guess I started playing cello when I was 5, and then cello wasn't cool to me. I wanted to be just like this childhood friend Josh Gilbert, who was a piano player. So I switched from cello to piano, and as I got older, my attentions kind of turned towards breakdancing and BMX, and then skateboarding, kind of all of the trends of the day in the early 80s. And then I got into synthesizers. So around the same time, when I was in junior high, actually, and before that, I was really into computer programming and synthesizers. And the funny thing is that's sort of where I ended up later in life, which, when you ask people what they want to do when they're kids, become a fireman or astronaut or whatnot, rarely is that the case. And so the funny thing is somebody was talking to me recently, maybe a couple months back, and they're like, oh, you're doing exactly what you planned when you were like 10 years old. So, so in junior high, I got my first synthesizer. I used to go over to, it's so funny how, anyway, I used to go over to my friend's house, and he had a synthesizer, and I was really amazed with how it could make helicopter sounds with like a sharp LFO on white noise or something like that.
Sure.
But anyway, so he inspired me to get a synthesizer at some point, and I convinced my mother, who was, anything to placate one of the 3 young boys as a single mother, was happy to do. And we had, my friends and I, we had like a Joy Division, a New Order, and Cure cover band, back when it was alternative music. And that was sort of my first foray into electronic music, it was tons of fun. And our band name was called the Ukrainian Beet Farmers.
Oh man, that's awesome.
Yeah, anyway, it was funny times. And then, my first year in high school, the high school I went to my freshman year actually was a huge high school. When I went, there was like 3,500 students in the suburbs of Chicago, and they had an electronic music studio, and all the older kids, the like seniors, were like DJs and making and DJing like acid house and stuff like that at the time. And I didn't even understand what acid house was. But they're like, oh, you just hook up the drum machine to the synthesizer. So I started trying to make acid house by like taking some whatever crappy drum machine they had connected to Casio CZ1000 and just having random MIDI notes trigger the Casio CZ1000
Right.
and thinking I was making acid house. But anyway, so it was that. And then whatever, a lot of punk bands and other little bands in high school, and then went to college at Wesleyan, where they had a really great electronic music department and experimental music department, and it was through that I got back into coding again, and and it was the rave era, and that's kind of like a brief synopsis of like my first 20 years of my life.
Sure. Now, at Wesleyan, well, first of all, I have to say I'm pretty blown away that you had an opportunity to go to a high school that had electronic music lab.
Mr. Mac.
Mr. Mac.
That was our teacher. He was like an amazing trumpet player and had a huge underbite, and he was in charge of the marching band or the student band. And he also he was amazing, actually. I wonder what that guy's up to nowadays.
Yeah, my wife teaches at a school, and just they get technology like laptops or tablets or whatever, but things are locked down so heavily that you can't actually do anything hardly with them. How did they accomplish a high school electronic music studio without having it so like the drum machine was bolted to the table or something?
There was no issue with it. It was like, I can't remember if we had keys or if we had to sign in and sign up for time. It's kind of typical of like a college.
Right.
I mean, it was big. I went to, the high school. When my brother went there, it was 6,500 students, but 74 when I was born was the nadir of the birthing in the US, and so it halved in size like in 6 years. So I don't know what that was about. Everyone was too drugged out and going to the disco or something like that in 74.
Right, apparently. So you went to Wesleyan and kind of followed up. Now, at Wesleyan, did you study computer programming or did you study electronic music or some combination of the two?
Well, I started out thinking I went there with a definitive plan I wanted to make synthesizers, and they had some program, I think, with Caltech or something like that, where you could go for 3 years at a liberal arts college, and then you go 2 years to like an engineering school, and you could get a dual degree in physics and electrical engineering. And that was like my total plan, that I wanted to do that and be a hard, at that point, it was only just at that time that like computers were starting to do real-time processing. The PowerPC had just come out, and Hyperprism had just come out. But so at that point, it was still sort of like hardware was the route that you would have taken, or that I imagined myself taking.
Right.
And after my first semester, I was in the physics program, and which I really liked, actually, but I was also taking some, electronic music survey courses with Ron Quivola, who was kind of like my mentor throughout college. And it was in those classes I started doing a little bit of C programming, and working with C music and other Music 5 variants and stuff like that. And so I took my second semester, I took the intro computer science class, which was like programming in Scheme, a Lisp variant. And it was during that course where I was like, and I was actually talking two nights ago with Stefan about like the immediate gratification of computer programming, and where, in physics, it's interesting stuff, but it's kind of dry. And even if you're doing something hands-on, there's a lot of time that it takes,
Right.
To get results. And also, but with computer programming, it's this, it totally, especially at that age in your life, it's so immediately gratifying that, you feel like you do this thing, it gives you feedback. Anyway, and it directly related to my electronic music class. So, I switched majors my sophomore year to computer science, and that's what my degree's in. But I did do a lot of electronic music and continued doing coding within the electronic music department. At that point, a lot of my stuff was in Formula, which was the fourth-based music language that Ron had worked on, and then also HMSL, which was another fourth variant where we would use it as a controller for assembly that we would code for the DSP 5600, the microprocessor that was being used, kind of commonly, and the Motorola one, and 56,000 rather.
Right.
So. Yeah, those were the days.
Yeah, well, I think it's the way computers are now. It's kind of hard to even wrap your head around how low level you had to work in order to pull off real time audio. What kind of time frame was this that you were doing the studying at Wesleyan? What years?
Like 92 to 96.
Okay, yeah, so that would have been when a desktop machine was going to have trouble doing a whole lot of real-time audio. Wouldn't that be true?
It was like PowerPC. That was like the first kind of like consumer computer. We also had some Next stations, some pizza boxes.
Oh, right,
and those actually could do some real-time DSP on the 56K chip that was embedded. Although I didn't do too much real-time stuff on those. I did mostly Music 5 style, like offline work. But basically, what was it? It's like an Audio Media 2 card, which you could put inside your PowerPC, and you could upload via HMSL. You could upload assembly code and then have it output the audio. But at the same time, like HyperPrism had just come out, and you could do some processing there. The other big thing that we worked with was Kima, which you couldn't really easily do DSP programming on that platform at that point. I'm not sure where it's at nowadays, but you could do like Smalltalk programming for UI and control rate stuff.
Right.
With their DSP blocks.
So, how did you eventually run into Max then? Because, by this point, by 96, Max was already kind of floating around as a MIDI processing tool, right?
Yeah, and actually, they had Max in the studios in college, but I never used it back then because most of the MIDI stuff I was doing was in Formula.
Sure.
And we would, similar things to Max, but, this interactive fourth-based environment. And I remember, what were those, there was like a box for pitch to MIDI conversion, like a Pitch Rider 2 or whatever it was called. But I remember, we were doing pieces with that going into Formula and then processing the pitches and coming up with real-time accompaniment and chord changes and stuff like that.
Sure.
So I didn't actually use use Macs at all in college, but kind of similar types of things that one would do with Macs. And then, I moved out to San Francisco. I thought I really wanted to be a plugin developer, and I thought like that there was like a world where you could get hired to make Sounded at 16 plugins,
Right.
Because that was like one of the available desktop plugin formats at the time that I learned how to do, and it was like impossible to get a job doing that. Although I ended up working for a company after doing some web programming that did make some Sounded at 16 plugins, although they just had me doing tech support and working on the like web interface and like the UI for a web MIDI plugin back then.
Oh, okay.
Anyway.
Who was that?
And that was in Envision Interactive, and they had the Cyber Sound was the name of their suite of plugins, and they're like basically virtual sound canvas or whatever, their general MIDI synth for web browsers. Then I worked for a traffic software company that did basically like what Google Maps does now, dynamic route guidance based on traffic conditions, and somehow through like the club nights I was going to at the time. Actually, I think it was in front of Static, which my friend Seth Sutek and other friends were DJing at the time. My friend Darren Marshall, who actually used to work at Opcode with David, or knew of David or something like that. And he told me, oh, there's this thing that you would be really into called MSP. And I downloaded it, bought a copy, and then the same day I downloaded the program, I downloaded the SDK and started coding some Max externs. And after about a month of using it, I sent a resume with those externs to David, and so my first use of Max was with MSP, and pretty early on in the first year or two, it would have been 98, in the fall of 98, and then all of a sudden I got lucky and got hired, and so I only had about a month or 2 months of working with Max before working with cycling. So
that's really interesting. It sounded like a lot of your background kind of set you up in a good place for it. That's cool. Now, before we get further maybe into Max, I want to talk a little bit about something you just hinted at there, which is, standing outside of Static, talking with your, where some of your friends DJ'd and talking with other friends about tech stuff. You were actually part of a scene in San Francisco that really produced some amazing stuff back in the day. And I use that back in the day thing as if it was my day, but it really wasn't, But I feel like...
Well, you were making some techno around that time, too.
I was, but...
Maybe a little earlier.
Yeah, and mine was also really very much of the Midwest dent, which was sort of like, heavy on the 909 with a little bit of evil sprinkled in, right?
Hardcore gabber.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a cool time.
It was
Milwaukee scene.
Yeah, the Milwaukee scene was really pretty exciting at the time, and it was especially interesting because there was like some kind of direct tunnel between Milwaukee and Belgium. So we were doing a lot of stuff that was getting all of its play in Belgium, right? And so you get pictures back of all these guys in white track suits dancing, and they'd say, they're dancing to your track, man. And I'm like, that was awesome.
Rotterdam and Antwerp, and all the Dutch and the Belgians.
Yeah, the Dutch and the Belgians were nuts about that stuff. But the scene that you were involved in really was what now I think we just kind of lump into a group as part of the glitch scene. But it seems like, when I was kind of watching it happen, it was really kind of an interesting thing of sort of, the embrace of glitchy behaviors, but also a lot of influence from dub and a fair amount of psychedelic influence. It was a really kind of interesting milieu that was developing out of San Francisco. What can you tell me a little bit about what that was like from your perspective?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was a fun time for sure. Basically, right after college, I went out to San Francisco, and a couple of friends of mine came out from the East Coast as well, and we were all, Chicago house, Detroit techno, and Berlin techno. So, and we got to San Francisco, and for the most part, we were kind of like, oh, this is really weird, because the San Francisco scene overall was more concerned with, West Coast breaks and progressive trance and progressive house and stuff like that. And being young, we were pretty arrogant and kind of like, screw this stuff. And we started doing underground parties that were all kind of focused on like Chicago, Detroit, and Berlin. And we met up. There was a couple of people that were doing parties out in San Francisco at that time. One was Mad, which was a techno night, and then Static started up, and those were kind of like the two different kind of club nights that were kind of like the music that we were into. But this was still like much more dance floor focused, which, the glitch stuff kind of like ended up diverging from that.
Right.
But those were like the two main things where we met up with folks there, and we were doing underground parties, and we brought out Richie Houghton, and we brought out a bunch of Chicago Dance Mania folks, like DJ Funk and Milton and Dion, and then like Ghetto Tech from Detroit, which is like Godfather, and a bunch of folks. And yeah, anyways, so it was still kind of like very underground rave focus, and with a hard edge, everything with a hard edge, which was like really important to us at the time. But a lot of the people actually that were doing that also had this kind of background with experimental music, like, doing stuff in college or otherwise with kind of like I was discussing before, these more electroacoustic or experimental electronic works. And so that bled into the music, and we were really obsessed with the whole lineage of Basic Channel and Chain Reaction from Berlin, which had this dub influence. And so kind of all these different things collided, this kind of aggressive underground club music from Chicago and Detroit and Berlin, and experimental stuff. At that time, it was like interesting, like all the people that kind of came together around that were like the first record I did was with Juan Mendez for a label that we were doing called Sidetracks. And he's like really big right now as Silent Servant. And that was like a super, super fun collaboration. And a lot of others are still working on stuff. And it's cool how it still lives today in some form.
Well, yeah, I was going to say a lot of the people that were your friends and then your collaborators have gone on to do some pretty extensive stuff. I mean, Sutek is certainly still very active. And I know you did you kind of hung out with, but also did some work with Blechtem.
Blechtem from Blechtem, yeah.
Yes. And you worked with and kind of hung out with these people, right?
Yeah, and that was like another area where the kind of experimental stuff came in, because they both were in the Mills program, and the Mills program
Right.
has, for those that don't know, a long-running, fabulous experimental music department. And so they were making this maniacal techno music, and they used to host. Actually, it was like so great. It was underneath the seating of the main auditorium in this kind of warm ambient heating space. And I don't know if like the school even approved of them doing it, but they used to do these nights called globule, and they would open up the sort of like moist nostril of the auditorium for people to play there. And I played there, and Wobbly played there, and Blectum played there, and lots of our friends did. And so yeah, there was a period also where Safety Scissors, Seth Horvitz, Sutek, and Kristen Erickson, Kevin Blectum were all living together, and I would spend tons of time over there with all three of them. But yeah, so the Blectums, that was really fun to like meet up with them, and they were one of the first releases on the record label that we ended up doing a little bit later called Orthlorn Musorg.
Yeah, I was going to transition into that because a lot of the people that we're talking about make up the, certainly the first half of the releases or of the catalog of that label, right?
Yep.
So I have to ask, Orthlorn Musorg, the name, where'd that come from? I'm just really curious.
Yeah, so it was just kind of a pig English variant of Earthling music.
Okay.
Yeah, we had this. We actually had a Translator on our website that would translate everything, basically just replacing every vowel with OR, but it was some slightly different logic.
Okay. Well, there's this sense, from the outside, and I would say that certainly I was an outsider of this world, even though I watched it with great excitement. But there was also this sense that in addition to being interesting music and music that kind of embraced the techno concept while still pushing it forward, there was also this sense of it being really smart people's music, right? And knowing now some of the people that make up some of your early running crew there, it really was a lot of really intelligent, really highly educated people that were equally at home busting code as well as busting out music. How do you think that ended up influencing the scene and the music that was created?
Yeah. I mean, basically, it was all friends, or not exclusively, but primarily friends. And somehow there was this, I don't know if it was also in other cities, but in San Francisco, there's like a long running weirdo nerd culture that also is into, parties and dancing and psychedelics. I mean, if you, go back to the 70s, it has this kind of long history. And then through the 90s, the whole Mondo 2000 cyberpunk scene and this, that, and the other. And so there was like a lot of overlap between that sort of psychedelic esoteric culture with like hedonism and dancing and things like that. And so, I don't think there was like a direct lineage or something like that. There was like some cultural blurring there, or somehow that's how we ended up there, many of us. And actually it was right when we started Orthlorn Musorg at the end of the 90s. It was sort of like, okay, raving had sort of run its course for a lot of us in a way, and we were looking into what are some things that we wanted to do that deviated from that. The originally, this, techno and house music and stuff like that felt really subversive and kind of a political act to get together and dance all night in basements and warehouses and stuff like that. And by the end of the 90s, it sort of had become, like the new norm. And so we kind of, as typical young people do, wanted to do something different. And some of the other influences that we had blurred in to a greater degree.
It's interesting you mentioned sort of like the Mondo 2000 culture, because I feel like on one hand that sort of spread the word, they and like Wired Magazine and the techno yuppie kind of thing that they promoted seemed to really it popularized it, and it kind of spread the word, but also it seemed to have kind of normed that whole culture, a culture that seemed to actually really want to be underground. Did you see things change in kind of a not particularly fun way at that point?
Well, that was kind of like the first big tech wave that, at least in my history in San Francisco, was the late '90s during the sort of web bubble and whatnot. It didn't feel so. I mean, there were some cultural effects of that, and actually, like looking back as I compare it with like this wave that's sort of the current bubble in San Francisco, with tech. At the time, I think there was also sort of like yuppies go home, like screw this, and you had all these elements as part of that, including some of the people that were involved in that sort of cyberpunk world. But I wasn't that deep into that universe. I mean, I had read Mondo 2000 earlier in the '90s when I was living on the East Coast, and was like, oh, that place seems cool. But once I got out there, it wasn't really too much in my purview. There was a huge anti-gentrification wave happening at that time as well, and it's interesting to look back and how much how basically, as I see it, like there was like sort of this burst about the web, and then there was like a contraction where people weren't sure whether the web was really a thing that was going to happen. And then the web was sort of established, and then social media. You had sort of the mid 2000, 2005, 2007. You had the second wave, and that was more regarding social media. Then like, oh, is that viable? And then now there's this third wave where all these things are totally established. There's no turning back, and it's, it's depressing some days, but yeah.
When I look back at the Musork catalog, I see that there's some good memories there. But one that jumps out to me that I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about was the Gold Chains album.
Oh, yeah.
That was actually a pretty big deal in San Francisco, wasn't it?
I don't know that it was a huge deal in San Francisco, but it actually probably sold more copies in Europe than anywhere in the U.S. San Francisco did. But yeah, I mean, it was really fun to work on, and there was, like within like a small scene, there was like a lot of excitement surrounding it, but big by any means is, a very relative term.
Right. Well, that was kind of a different release for you, because, I mean, I had really interesting conversations with Topher Lafata, who was Gold Chains. I had interesting conversations because, first of all, he mentioned that he had gotten some opportunities to do like commercial music and stuff like that based on that release, which was pretty interesting. But also, he talked a lot about the influences that you had in the making of that, particularly with some stylistic editing things and stuff that you brought to the table for that release. And I just I'm curious about your memories of making that thing, as well as making the video for it.
Yeah, it was like a really fun time. We would just go into the studio, and I mean, Topher's brilliant, total freak, and not that I'm not a freak too, but somehow our freakiness came together in ways that for each of us was really playful, and sort of, we would change the style in some of the songs, every 8 measures or so, or 16 measures, and just had a lot of fun, which was really nice for me at the time, since a lot of the music I had been working on was more sort of like focused and modal techno music that sort of like stayed in a certain musical sphere, which I love a lot, but it didn't have as much playfulness. And so there was something about working with another person that also made it more free for that kind of play, which I really loved. So.
Yeah. Well, it was definitely fun. And When you first mentioned this to me, you mentioned it by saying, hey, check out this video. So I had not heard the music before I saw the video. And here rolls this video with like a bunch of people I know, some of them being friends, doing this thing. And did you work with Ruben on that video?
Yeah, Ruben shot that video.
Yeah, okay.
It was one of his early videos, and it was, it's been great to see his whole trajectory where the first video he ever really made after college.
Well, we're talking about Ruben Fleischer. We should make that clear, right?
Oh, right, yeah, Ruben Fleischer, who is now a big-time Hollywood director and close friend, and he had a vision of what he wanted to do. He wanted to direct, and so he went to Chicago and Detroit and did. I think it's up on YouTube still. A documentary about Chicago ghetto tracks and ghetto tech in Detroit, interviewing a lot of the people that we knew from doing parties in the 90s, and that was the first thing he did. And then he started directing music videos, and Topher's was one of his early ones. And, he later went on to do one of MIA's first videos and Dizzy Rascal's first videos and a bunch of other really talented artists. So he just kept with it, and now he's doing big features for Hollywood. So
right. That's
been fun.
amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Back in the day.
Back in the day. So we're going to jump back into kind of your professional stream a little bit, because, I mean, you were weaving artistic work, so you've sort of downplayed the amount of music that you've done, but you did releases on a fair number of labels, as well as your own. But also, you were always kind of active in doing live performance and doing DJing as well, right?
Correct, yeah.
And at the same time, you were starting to sort of like push the envelopes on software development. So this would have been roughly about the time that the Orthlong Musart catalog was being built up. That was roughly the same time that you also were working on the development of Jitter, which was the video extensions for Macs, right?
Yeah, actually, I started working for Cycling about at the same time that we started working on the record label for Orthlong Musorg, and a lot of the stuff was going on in parallel. It was after working at Cycling for a couple of years that, I had been doing live performance and started to, dislike just doing the implicit performance of the machine operator, and then I started working on some video software for doing performance in conjunction with the audio stuff, and so it was all very contemporary, early 2000s.
So did you ever sleep? I mean, It seems like so much was going on for you at the time.
I have I was working like crazy, because when I was first working on Jitter, it was after I was working on my cycling stuff, because I was just doing it on my own before I talked with David about whether or not he would be interested in having it as like a cycling release. Right. So at that point, I was working a lot, and actually I had just released a couple albums prior to that, and actually while I was working on Jitter, I wasn't doing a lot of music production. So there was like a couple years, like 2000 to 2002, where I wasn't doing tons of music production, a little bit here and there, but
interesting.
So it did kind of like alternate. Like before that, I was focusing all my extra time on recording and DJing and stuff like that, and then I kind of shifted my, whatever this spare time is. I usually have one or two things that I get pretty heavily into.
Right. I'm always curious about people who sort of began working in one area and kind of switch into working with other media. And for you, that switch was from music and coding around music to the video world. What drew you into video, first of all? And secondly, how comfortable of a transition did that feel? It's
one of those things where it's always nice that, you gain some sort of facility in one area, and you kind of want to keep moving. And, because learning and growing and stuff like that is maybe the thing that at least but many people value. So it felt pretty normal and natural, and it was just something like I didn't know a lot about, and I wanted to do some stuff with, and just started learning as I went. And then that kind of continued away from video stuff into sort of performance art and group exercise and all this other weird stuff that I end up doing, from more of a traditional art practice. But yeah, so it was pretty seamless, actually, and there was actually a fair amount of overlap with kind of making music, performing music and video, then working more on video, then migrating to live performance video, then moving just to performance without any video. So there was a lot of overlap in all those things. So it felt pretty normal, and always kind of learning as I went.
Well, that's cool. Now let's kind of fast forward to the present, because we're running out of time already. I can't believe it. But you have, for a while, you kind of were out of scene, but you've kind of stepped in pretty thick again. First of all, you're doing this live performance work under the name Kit and Claus, right?
Yeah, I'm with my friend Brian Hawk, who makes music as Claus, C, period, L, period, A, period, W, period, S, period.
All right, so that has like all of the weight of like an evil 007 kind of a thing. Does that actually stand for anything, or is it just part of the fun?
It does stand for something, and I can't remember. You'll have to ask Brian. No, I knew what it stood for, but I can't at all. No.
So how did you start with that collaboration? How did he draw you in?
We were just hanging out, and we like each other's music a bunch, and he's like, "Oh, we should do like a set together." He actually had just bought like a stack of HR16s, or stacked. It was like 5 units, like a couple MMT8s and a couple HR16s, some of which didn't work. And he's like, "Yeah, you should come over and we'll just work on something to do like a live set." And so went over, and we both had a great time. We both, again, like, these collaborations are really fun times for me, where it can be really playful and just have fun with music. And so we did that, basically got some sandwiches, some beers, and hung out and made music. And the whole time, like every time really that we get together and work on stuff, it's just like us jamming. It's not a lot of talking or discussion about what we want to do. We just turn on the machines and start recording sequences and jamming with each other. From that, we started doing a couple shows, and then we're like, "Oh, these are cool. These are really fun. Let's start tracking them." And we started tracking a bunch of stuff. And actually, in a month or two, our first release is going to come out on Gooeyland Electro, which is kind of like a niche dark synth label out of the Netherlands.
Cool.
Sub-label Enfant Terrible.
Oh, all right. What's kind of unique about this, especially as it comes to your playing, is that it's an all hardware performance, right? I mean, you don't use computers at all, is that correct?
I mean, we don't use personal computers or laptops. I mean, obviously, the HR16 and MMT8, they're computers, but simpler computers, perhaps.
Right. But it is, I mean, you're doing all of this through a musical hardware interface, that's kind of interesting. And it's, in a way, too, it's a bit of a throwback to some of your earliest music experience, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. And it's also, spending the day job working on coding, it's really nice to just kind of have some sort of separation between, working on music for fun and what I get stressed out about and am not sleeping properly because of at work. Although, I mean, I still use computers for a lot of other stuff, but for this project, it's very hardware focused.
What are some of the other projects? What are some of the other things you're working on artistically right now?
The other big thing that's a collaboration with my friend is a noise project called Tuyurikua, which is Estonian for killjoy. And that's an all hardware project as well, but more kind of pure noise or ambient or something like that. And that uses actually modular synth stuff and, guitar pedals or tabletop electronics. So again, that's, a nice deviation from some of the day job, although a lot of the same principles. I mean, doing analog modular synthesis is very similar to working with Macs and things like that. But it's nice to just have some sort of boundaries in my life.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, one of the things you said a bit ago too was, and if this is an area you'd rather not talk about, that's fine. But you talked a little bit about how you had at one point viewed the music that you were doing as, and especially the rave culture thing, as sort of a political act. Now,
Yep.
I thought that was an interesting use of phrase because in addition to the many things that you are, one of the things I know that you are is very politically aware, and you're active in political actions of different sorts. Is this something you feel comfortable talking about?
Sure. I mean,
Okay.
basically, all this cultural stuff I do view as a political act as well. And, I mean, if we go back to my younger days in high school, being straight edge, vegetarian, communist, and then kind of like drifting away from kind of like some sort of explicit form of politics in a more sort of diffuse cultural politic.
Right.
In recent years, got much more involved with all the stuff that's happening worldwide as far as these different mass movements, whether it's, Occupy or some other variant. But yeah, was very involved in the Occupy stuff in the Bay Area, and it was super exciting time to actually see some amount of cultural momentum in that space and political momentum with people on the ground. And while I'm not there in Ferguson, I'm definitely very supportive and in solidarity with the actions of people on the street, fighting police suppression and the incredibly racist society in which we live in, whether it's a relationship to education, to incarceration, to actual murder on the streets. There are things that I feel strongly about. And somehow, even though it might seem sort of oblique, there's some sort of relationship with working on culture, making music, taking acts where you get together in a physical space with other people and dance that somehow seems directly opposed to the very, very controlled society that we live in. So definitely a big part of my life, and the things that I'd like to see if I'm going to spend any time working on something in this world. Hopefully, it would contribute somewhat to trying to do things differently than economic, militaristic control.
Right. When I think of you, I think that there's not that much disconnect between what you do in your coding life and what you do in your performance life, but also what you do in your political life. I mean, you seem to kind of embed all of these in everything that you do. I'm wondering if that's conscious or if that's just what happens when you live that life.
Well, thank you. I guess there are there's overlap. I mean, there's definitely certain impulses and trends, I guess, that kind of lead to these different things. And there's some sort of parallel, whether it's cultural, spiritual, political, technical, or something like that. But also, I don't know, the human mind is very adept at matching patterns. So while the actual experience in these things is very different, actually, in these different worlds, and like important to me that I have these different aspects of my life, and I think everybody has that. It does make an easy narrative somehow, but some of that narrative I think is maybe superimposed.
Yeah, perhaps so. in any case, at least again from my seat, that's the way it looks sometimes. So I'll say it that way. Man, we've gone well over our time now, but and I want to thank you for the time that you spent with us. Now, before we go, one of the things I would like to kind of talk about, and this is sort of on behalf of the listeners as much as for my own interest. I think that one of the things that a lot of people would be curious about is what you think is sort of like a trajectory of an artistic and technological combined life. So, the track that you took, which was to have a heavy technical but musically related education, and then you moved to San Francisco before it's much of, there's much of a thing happening there. You sort of develop a scene, and then San Francisco blows up and all this kind of stuff. That kind of option doesn't really exist, or certainly following your exact tracks doesn't exist, right?
Oh, and I wouldn't recommend trying to follow like any sort of traditional model that any others have done, but maybe in some general terms, I guess.
Well, how do you think that people can find, what do you think is a way that people can use to find their own track?
Well, I definitely wouldn't encourage any roadmap. That would be like the roadmap step number one. Basically, continue like some process of self-investigation. Don't take yourself too seriously. Spend time. I mean, finding the time to like deepen an investigation. Not that like, I'm a big fan actually of dilettantism and like exploration and not taking things seriously, but also, having serious fun or something like that would be something I would encourage. But I don't know. I mean, the cultural landscape nowadays is significantly different than when I was growing up. And there's really cool stuff that's happening, whether it's kind of like the South London music scene or younger people making techno music or just kind of off-the-wall stuff that doesn't really make any sense, given like a traditional cultural narrative or something like that, that I think basically people are doing it, sometimes a little frenetic and blind or like chaotic, and I actually love that. So keeping some chaos in your life, I think, is probably something I would encourage. But I don't know how to offer any advice to anybody as to doing these things. And I don't know, self-investigation, larger social critique, patience, frenzy, chaos. Those would be the things that I would, I guess, encourage.
Well, it's interesting you say that you don't think that you actually have any advice, but the advice you give is the advice that not that many people put out there. If you Google, give me some artistic career advice, they'll say, find a good school, blah, blah, blah. Nobody's saying embrace chaos. But I think that's a really great point. Embracing the chaos of the time is really how you put yourself in a position to activate interesting things. Exploring broader context is also something that is actually the antithesis of what a lot of current thought is. And maybe that actually does end up being a lot more legit advice than you might think. So
at this point in my life, I'm trying to follow the younger people. So
there you go.
I want their advice. I don't want to give them advice. I want to follow theirs.
Very, very wise. Joshua, I want to thank you so much for spending the time with us. I know you're really busy, and I know that you just did some traveling, so you're probably really bushed as well. But I appreciate you talking to us. Thanks for being my 50th guest on the podcast. It's really great to have you be a part of it.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure. And as much as interviews somehow make me uncomfortable, this was a lot of fun.
Well, thanks. Yeah, likewise. And for me, it was great because I got to know a little bit more about you, too. And if nothing else, we got to talk smart about some of your friends, which is always great as well. Thanks a lot, and have a great day. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care.
Bye. And there you have it. Lucky number 50 is in the bag. That represents 1 year's worth of podcasts. I had to take 2 weekends off, one of them for illness, one of them for a trip down to fabulous Taos, New Mexico. Otherwise, I started 1 year ago, and it's really been a fantastic trip for me. I really appreciate all the people that were willing to be interviewed or chat with me or whatever you want to call it. But also, I really want to thank all the listeners. We've had a tremendous amount of feedback from people that listened. And you've helped make this one of the more interesting and important podcasts that are out there. So I want to thank everybody for your participation. For all the people that have helped in a variety of different ways, I want to thank you as well. And with that, I'm going to sign off for year number 1 of the Art, Music, and Technology podcast. Thank you so much.